Right, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Coral Reef session. I feel like I'm on the Starship Enterprise trying to get the whole team teleported into the same space. So I think we've made it here, and the future has arrived. So my name is David Obura. I'm a coral reef scientist based in Kenya, in East Africa, in the Indian Ocean. So I'm a little bit outside of my region in this session, but I'm really pleased to be here in this coral reef session co-organized with the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network of GEO MBON and hosted by the Air Center. And particularly for me, I started my coral reef career at the University of Miami with Mark, one of our speakers. And so I know a little bit about the Caribbean, but also this session is particularly interesting to me with the high Brazilian representation, because there's a lot of connections I feel between Mozambique and in my region and Brazil, of course, and collaborations that could start up with that. But I won't take long because we're starting a little bit late. Just a few mechanics of the session. So we have the audience within the Zoom room over here, and we have some live streaming. For those in Zoom, please make sure your microphones are muted when you're not speaking, also for the speakers when you move on. And for some of the presentations, it may help for the viewers if you move your Zoom windows around, just so you can see the whole presentation. We'll have 10 minutes per speaker. I'll try and keep people to that strictly, and we'll have questions afterwards, after all the speakers have finished. So please keep your questions for that. You can write them into the chat as well, so to make sure that we have them, and then we'll go through them in some level of order. We'll have a discussion of about 15 minutes, hopefully at the end. And if the discussion is still going, we still have the option after the closing to stay on in this Zoom room for another 30 minutes in a breakout room to continue discussions, particularly if you want to have smaller group discussions. Those of you who are watching live or streaming online, the link to the breakout room will show in your chats for 15 minutes prior to the end of the session. So keep an eye out for that. And when the session closes, you can switch to Zoom and come and join us in that. So without further ado, I'll introduce each speaker as they're about to talk, and we have 5, so with 10 minutes each. So first, I have the pleasure to have Dr. Milton Kampel. He's an oceanographer at the National Institute for Space Research in Brazil, focusing on remote sensing of the ocean. His talk will present a little bit about his group, what they do, and some remote sensing topics, including in relation to a corals monitoring program in the Atlantic region. So I'll hand over to Milton. Thank you.
So thank you very much, David, for the introduction. And I will close my video here just to save some internet band from here, okay? And now I'll share my screen. Okay, here it goes. Hi for all, my name is Milton Kampel. I am a satellite oceanographer from Brazil. And first, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for the invitation to participate in this session on corals. I work at the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research, INPE, which is a civil research institute of the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation of Brazil. INPE's priority engagement areas include the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We had the successful launch of the Cibers 4A satellite in December 2019, whose commissioning was completed in August 2020. Images from the MOOCs, WPM, and WFI cameras are generated and distributed routinely. This mission is part of a family of satellites started with Cibers 1. Unfortunately, we don't know what the future of this program will be. Here we can see examples of images from the Cibers 4A WPM camera of the Coroa Vermelha on the right in the coastal arc south of Bahia, acquired on 7 August 2020 in a fusion of the panchromatic band with the multispectrum bands in the blue, green, and red, and the Abrolhos archipelago on the left in the offshore arc from 12 August 2020. We are waiting for the launch of the Amazonia 1 remote sensing satellite, the first to use the multi-mission platform developed at INPE, focused on monitoring deforestation and vegetation cover. Due to COVID-19, the launch was postponed to February 15, 2021. Coral reefs are among the most diverse and productive ecosystems worldwide and provide a variety of goods and services to many tropical and subtropical coastal nations. Coral reef health and diversity are on the decline worldwide in response to local human impacts and global changes in climate, and this trend is expected to continue. Millions of people depend on intact reefs for various socioeconomic and ecological values, and thus these ecosystems are crucial to protect. In response, programs to monitor the health of coral reef ecosystems have been and continue to be implemented based on field surveys at global and regional scales, such as the Reef Check, the Coral Watch Project, and the Coral Reef Degradation in the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean Coastal Marine Productivity Program, the Atlantic and Gulf Rapid Reef Assessment Program, the Coral Vivo Project, and the Abrolhos Network in Brazil. The Abrolhos Network is an interinstitutional and multidisciplinary research group encompassing scientists from the Rio de Janeiro Botanical Gardens, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Espírito Santo, Pernambuco, São Paulo, and Paraná, and the National Institute for Space Research, encompassing 12 institutions and more than 100 people directly engaged. Activities are geographically focused on the Abrolhos Bank, South Atlantic's most biodiverse region, with coral reefs, mangrove, estuaries, rhodolites, and seagrass beds. Main objective is to provide a sound and multidisciplinary knowledge database about the Abrolhos Bank in order to stimulate the conservation of the region's unique biodiversity and the sustainable use of its natural resources. The initiative also aims to build local capacities through the active and continuous engagement of students. The group is thematically focused on the structure and functioning of marine ecosystems and their interfaces with land-based stressors and the climate, including clusters actively working on habitat mapping, long-term dynamics of reef ecosystems, microbial ecology and biogeochemistry, paleoecology and sedimentology, physical oceanography, fisheries resources, marine protected areas effects, effectiveness and planning, with increasing attention to climate change effects on reefs. Results and outreach are continuously shared with management agencies and local communities, including technical support for management plans and independent environmental impact assessments. Monitoring by field surveys provides accurate data but at highly localized scales, and so is not cost-effective for reef-scale monitoring at frequent time points. Remote sensing is an alternative and complementary approach, cost-effective, and allows synoptic monitoring of large marine areas. Remote sensing can discriminate between different components of a reef ecosystem, such as habitat type and physical structure. It can also provide climate-relevant measurements, such as temperature, salinity, and wind energy, and biological estimates such as primary productivity. More recently, remote sensing approaches has benefited from instruments with better resolutions and computational advances in storage, processing, and data analysis capabilities. However, the success of any remote sensing application depends upon the collection of key environmental information that can be used to vicariously calibrate sensor radiance, test atmospheric correction procedures, and develop, test, and validate product algorithms. In the visible and near-infrared portions of the light spectrum, bottom reflectance is the central parameter in the remote sensing of coral reefs and depends on the physical structure and chemical substrate composition. Although remote sensing has great potential for application in studies of the sea bottom and coral environments, extracting the reflectance spectrum from orbital optical sensors is a complex task. Several processes affect the signal detected by remote sensor. There is a need for atmospheric correction and for water column correction. Coral environments are formations of biogenic reefs consolidated from algae and/or corals, sandstone reefs, and rocky shores, with the presence of corals being found from shallow coastal areas to greater depth. Although reefs are called coral, they are actually formations created by the joint action of other organisms, such as other invertebrates and calcareous algae. Reefs can be characterized according to the predominant organisms in their formation and can thus include two main types, coral reefs and rhodolith banks. The only true coral reefs that exist in the South Atlantic occur in Brazil. These reefs are characterized by having a low number of coral species compared to the Caribbean, but several of these species only occur in this region. In addition, Brazilian reefs are characterized by occurring in waters with a high degree of turbidity when compared to reefs in other regions of the planet. Large coral communities were recorded in Brazil from the Amazon River mouth and the Parcel of Manuel Luiz in the north, to the reefs in the Abrolhos region at the eastern Brazilian coast, and in oceanic islands, such as Atol das Rocas, Fernando de Noronha, and Ilha da Trindade, as well as in local spots to the south in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Santa Catarina. In general, Brazilian reefs have great discontinuities, and in many parts of their distribution, they appear as narrow lines close to the coast. In terms of connectivity, studies have shown that the Amazon River would act as a barrier to the larval dispersion of various species from and to the Caribbean region. Another barrier would be the Mesoatlantic, where the large open ocean between the American and African continents limits the larval dispersion between these two sides of the Atlantic. These barriers have already been observed for several species, such as the fire coral Meleaporal cicornis, that occurs in the Caribbean, Northwest Atlantic, Brazil, Southwest Atlantic, and the west coast of Africa, Southeast Atlantic. However, for the Porites astreoides coral, there is no differentiation between the populations of the Caribbean and Brazil, which indicates that the barrier of the Amazon River does not limit the distribution of all species. The operation of the Amazon mouth biogeographic filter is not completely known because information about the nature and extension of reef habitats of the Amazon mouth is still limited. The mesophotic reef system of the Amazon River is extensive, is impoverished in terms of biodiversity, and presents unique functional attributes due to the plume influence. The system provides relevant ecosystem services and functions as a selective biogeographic corridor between the Caribbean and the South Atlantic Ocean, and may give important insights in terms of future scenarios for forecasting coralline reef trajectories under acute climate changes. A new paradigm has emerged for management of coral reefs in an era of changing climate, managing for resilience. A fundamental need for such management to be effective is our ability to measure and map coral reef resilience. Remote sensing allows direct mapping of several ecosystem variables that influence reef resilience, including coral and algal cover, as well as a range of coral reef stressors. Despite the unprecedented number of studies on reef systems, information from this is rarely used in practical decision-making or included in implementing actions designed to ensure the resilience of these systems and protect them from these threats. We should adopt a multidisciplinary approach to lead an evolution from traditional threat management in individual portions of ecosystems to large-scale management strategies in complex socioeconomic and natural systems. I would like to thank the Emotions Group and the Abrolhos Network. I thank everyone for the audience, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you very much, Milton, for your presentation. I think that went perfectly, a nicely recorded one as well. So what we'll do is remind the listeners that please keep your questions for the end. You can write them into the chat box so Milton can have a look at them and prepare if you'd like. Without further ado, we'll go on to the next presentation. This is by Dr. Eric Hochberg. He's a senior scientist at the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences and principal investigator for NASA's Coral Reef Airborne Laboratory mission. And his talk is about the Coral Reef Airborne Laboratory and beyond. So Eric, over to you.
All right, we'll try sharing the screen. Does that appear to everybody? And can you hear me?
Yes, that's good.
All right.
Perfect.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here. As David just said, I'm going to talk. I want to give an introduction to the coral mission as a sort of demonstration of where we are in this field of coral reef remote sensing, and then a couple quick thoughts about where we might be able to go. So this is standard stuff. You heard it already. You know it very well, that reefs are important and they are threatened. I want to point out the bottom right here, we have the pretty coral reef going to the ugly coral reef. It's not that the reef itself is going away, it's that the character of the reef is changing. And really what we talk about reef degradation, we're talking about loss of coral, and the living coral that is an important constructor of the system. Here's a dramatic example, but that's what we're talking about, is coral. And if you think of it another way, the coral goes away, the reef doesn't go away, but something replaces the coral, and it's typically sand or rubble or algae living on the rubble. So the color of the thing changes from coral colored to algae colored, and that's the basis really for the remote sensing. But how do we do it before the remote sensing? These are all some wonderful photos I downloaded from various sites. Quadrats, transects, mantitos with digital photography or video or not. The bottom right there is sort of taking the coral reef world by storm. It's underwater photomosaics. So that picture, the bottom right, is probably 10 meters across, and it's stitched together about a few hundred photos. But it's all underwater, and it's all limited in scale that the diver can access. And so I want to point out, so I did a little study here, and I have to say that this is not exhaustive by any means. I downloaded data that I could find readily, and it's on coral cover from various programs. And I didn't ask people for the data. I just went online and looked for databases and found what I could. I spent some effort, but I didn't kill myself doing it. Then I took the latitudes, longitudes, and binned them to 1 kilometer grid cells. And I counted up how many quantitative observations were in each of those grid cells. And then I color coded them and plotted them. And you can see that by far, many of those 1 kilometer grid cells are represented by fewer than 20 observations in 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. And then I have a histogram of observations per cell there in the right-hand side of the map. So the point I want to make here is written on the bottom of the slide, that our underwater or in-water surveys are not capturing reefs at the ecosystem scale. We're seeing communities very well, but we're not seeing the ecosystem. And that's a big deal because it's a different perspective. When we want to understand how the ecosystem is doing, we have to scale from the community to the system. And that was the impetus. Of course, there's reefs all over the world, and there's a lot of them, and they're spread out over 200 square million kilometers of ocean. So doing in-water surveys isn't really practical. A back-of-the-envelope calculation, I would say that we've actually surveyed probably only about 0.1% of the world's reef area, quantitatively. That is, we actually have hard data that we can put error bars on. So this is the impetus for the coral mission, which was funded by NASA as a partnership between BIOS and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We have all these wonderful partners that helped us out. The aim was to collect high-density observations of reef condition across a large representative area of the world's reefs. So that is, make a big survey with uniform data set. So uniform data between Hawaii and the Great Barrier Reef, and Marianas, and try to capture a lot of different kinds of reefs, continental, oceanic, atoll, all of these sorts of things. And then the science objective was to take those data and do some analysis. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the remote sensing aspect of it. We did this. We completed the campaigns in May of 2017. We did the Great Barrier Reef. Well, I'll show you the next slide. Portions of the Great Barrier Reef. What these maps show the green boxes are our actual flight lines. So portions of the Great Barrier Reef, then Hawaii, then Mariana Islands, Palau, and Florida was a lucky bonus at the end of the mission. We were flying the airplane back to its base, and the weather was clear, and so we got data over Florida. All these data, by the way, are publicly available. I'll show you in the next slide. We covered of the Earth's surface about 75,000 square kilometers. Reef coverage is about 10,000 square kilometers, or 2% of the world's reef area. We did do in-water validation at several places, just not in Florida, because that was the sort of a lucky data get there. If you want the data, so here's my plug, you can go to search.earthdata.nasa.gov and search coral. And there are 2 data sets. You can see them in the middle. One is level 1 that's on the bottom, and the other is level 2. The level 2 data have all of the level 1 data plus our products. And I'm going to show you our products in a second. And level 1 is just the remote sensing data. And so if you want to generate your own products, you can do that. Be warned, an individual file is on the order of 7 to 10 gigabytes. So it's not for the faint of heart to download, but we have something like 300 some odd flight lines. Oh, here's an example. You can see this is from Hawaii. Clicking on a flight line, you can see the file name. Anyway, here are an example of the products. So on the left-hand side, the airplane flies at 28,000 feet. We do atmospheric corrections, and we get reflectance at the Earth's surface. We use that Earth's surface reflectance to calculate everything else, basically. We estimate the relative clarity of the water. That's the attenuation. We get the water depth. We get the bottom reflectance. And from the bottom reflectance, we make probabilities on what the benthic cover is, coral, algae, or sand. And we use that to figure out that's the probabilities. We use the probabilities to make actual estimates. We also model primary production and calcification based on light use efficiency models. So these are all the products that you can download in those level 2 files. This is just an example for Kaneohe Bay on Oahu and Hawaii. Now, obviously, this isn't the Atlantic. This is a demonstration, and just to show where we're at, what we can do. And here's a bigger example. This is from the Torres Strait in Northern Australia. There's 12 flight lines stitched together on the left-hand side. The map of the probabilities is in the middle. And for the coral science that we're doing that I'm not going to talk about, we have it been to 1 kilometer grids, basically to match the analysis I did earlier with the in-water data. So, so that's the sort of product we're getting at there. And it's doable, and we made this operational. Now, that's where we are, and we can do it. We can improve it, to be sure.
3 minutes, Eric.
Oh, thank you. I want to talk about the future and where we're going to go with this. So NASA is currently developing what they call the Surface Biology and Geology, or SBG, mission. And this is going to be a satellite or a few satellites. They're not exactly sure what it's going to be yet, to be launched in the late 2020s. And this is going to be sort of like Landsat on steroids. It's going to do a lot. They're going to look at ecosystems, agriculture, snow and ice. It's going to have the visible, the infrared, all the way up to the thermal infrared. And of course, there we have the coastal zones. And so this is a global mapper. It'll see the Earth every couple of weeks, the whole Earth, and clouds permitting, we'll be able to look at all the reefs of the world. And so I'm excited about that, but that's several years away. So in my last minute, I want to say, why not a CubeSat, and why not now? The technology exists. There's an example of an existing instrument. It's actually sitting on a bench at Jet Propulsion Laboratory. That's just an example. There are others that exist that can be used. This is ready to go in a 6U CubeSat. And it has a resolution of about 100 meters from orbit. And so on the right-hand side, I wanted to show what that looks like. This is Heron Reef and the Great Barrier Reef, 10 meters, 30, 60, 100 meters. Now, the reef scientist is 100 meters. That's pretty coarse. But the global reef area, 500,000 square kilometers, gives you 50 million reef pixels. And that would be a phenomenal advancement in our understanding of how reefs work, how they're distributed, so on and so forth, if we were able to get that done. The technology currently exists. It's not cheap, but it's not really expensive either. Millions, not tens of millions. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to answer your questions later on in the question and answer session.
Thank you, Eric. Fantastic. A nice presentation ending on such a forward-looking note as opposed to a conclusion. I personally like that, and I think it's really a time now to really look into the future as to what is possible rather than sitting back on what we've been able to do. So thank you very much, and I hope that stimulates some great conversation in the discussion session. So our third speaker we'll move to now is Dr. Rui Kikuchi. Rui is a marine geologist, and he's been engaged in using the AGRA coral reef monitoring protocol on the east shelf of Brazil and in the north. He's based in Salvador in the state of Bahia at the Federal University of Bahia, and he's a fellow of the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. And Rui will be speaking about the rising vulnerability of reefs in the Western South Atlantic. So now over to you.
Okay, thank you, David.
Okay, we can see. That's great.
Okay. So I'd like to thank you, David. I'd like to thank you also the organizing committee for having me here. So let's go to the rising vulnerability of reefs in the Western South Atlantic. So I will present reefs in the shelf of Brazil, have an overview of this distribution and their distinguishing characteristics, the impacts that reefs face from the global to local scales, and the most recent example of synergy between the global and local processes, a repeated bleaching and local acute pollution that we will be investigating in the next years. Sorry. Well, we, as David said, we've been applying the AGRA protocol in our monitoring activities, but either a protocol, a video transect protocol adapted from those that it's used in the Great Barrier Reef. And we are associated to the National Institute of Science and Technology for the Tropical Marine Environments, which is focused on studying the processes and spatial temporal heterogeneity and responses to climate change of these marine environments. Well, the Reef Ecosystems Working Group is aimed at identifying resilient and vulnerable reefs and the processes underlying their situation. And mainly we are focused on those yellow dots or yellow boxes, and I'm concerned mainly with the two boxes on the downside of this map of the Brazilian shelf. So as Milton said, we have either the shallow reefs that goes down to 30 meters and also the mesophotic reefs. They are spread in various spots along the shelf, along 2,000 kilometers of continental shelf from the Amazon down to the south of the Abrolhos bank here. And I'm concerned, I will be focused on the shallow reefs. These are marginal reefs because they thrive in high turbidity environments. We find that 24 coral species building these reefs, and 6 of them are endemic. Two characteristics are very important here. There are no branching corals here, and Millepora ossicornis is the fire coral, is a hydrocoral that occupies the niche of shallow water and high energy in reefs that are well developed. Another thing is that Mussusmilla brasiliensis is a coral that is endemic and occurs only southern from the San Francisco River Delta. It sits here in this red box. from here to the south, and it's one of the main reef builders. So that's why we call this region as the Mosesmilla brasiliensis domain. Well, there is two kinds of arrangements of reefs in a cross-shelf perspective. When the shelf is narrow, less than 50 kilometers, most of the reefs are submerged. They have at most 5 to 6 meters in height, then can be found attached to the coast, and these reefs can be substituted by beach rocks and by sometimes by cemented terraces. Other reefs occurs down to 30 or 40 meters, and then in the shelf break we find some rhodolith beds that are the sedimentary faces of drowned reefs. When the shelf is wide, we find more variable forms of reef forms, and these reefs are higher and can reach sea level, and we find here also the pinnacles that are mushroom-shaped reefs that are very characteristic of this region. We call it chaperon locally. So we find here also the at least 4 endemic species, Mosesmilla brasiliensis in the top picture, Mosesmilla hispida and Sideracea stellata in the middle picture here in the right side of the slide, and Mosesmilla harti. Montastera cavernosa is a cosmopolitan species that we find in deeper parts of the reef and also in very turbid waters reef. So, coral bleaching has been reported since 1982 here, but corals frequently recover and not die. But until this occurred until the event of 2010, when a mass mortality of Melepa ossicornis was reported in Todos os Santos Bay region. Also, pollution, overfishing, inadequate fishing practices, mineral and organisms exploitation, dredging, inadequate tourism practices are reported frequently in most of the sites that we research. Bioinvasions were reported recently. In terms of the reef health indicators, we have 2 categories here: the reefs that are closer to shore, in these reefs, living coral cover, density of large corals, and density of recruits are in a lower level than in reefs that are more than 5 kilometers away from the coast. And this is explained by the chlorophyll and the photosynthetic active radiation that distinguish from the turbid zone near to the coast from the more clear water offshore. So nearshore reefs are more vulnerable than offshore reefs, and they are thus at risk. Well, in 1 year, a little bit more than 1 year ago, starting in about 7 degrees south, in this region of the coast, we witnessed growing and a successive event of oil arriving at the coast, and this was widely broadcasted. And now the oil hit about more than 2,000 kilometers of coast. Many reefs were oiled, fisheries were affected, microorganisms like the scopopods and turtles, macroorganisms like this turtle were affected, and people in many places gathered to help cleaning the beaches, coral reefs, and mangrove forests.
2 minutes,
So
Rui.
okay. This event occurred between two thermal effects in these reefs where bleaching occurred. And so we have one big event, local event, over two events of global that are of global scale. So what we see here, the big question is how this will affect the reefs, and we will investigate this in the next year. So synergy exists among the global climate change scale problems, and this is aggravated by the local impacts. We there has been seen resilience in the short term, but the increase of frequency of thermal stresses and uncontrolled pollution might be bringing reefs to a turning point, and community engagement in monitoring activities is very important to raise awareness and gather information on a sustained basis. I have many people to thank that helped us along all these years. I thank you very much, David, and give it back to you.
Thank you very much, Rui. Excellent timing. I appreciate that. And very interesting. Certainly when we come to the discussion, I might ask about the oil spill, as we have a recent oil spill in Mauritius Island about 6 weeks ago, I think. And so a lot of questions about dealing with that.
Okay.
But thank you. I'll move to our fourth speaker now, and that's Dr. Beatrice Padovani Ferreira. She's a professor at the Department of Oceanography at the Federal University of Pernambuco in Recife. And she's worked for over 30 years on coral reef ecosystems in Brazil, including doing a lot of monitoring of reefs and fisheries using the reef check method with the Brazilian Institute of Environment and its research center, CEPEN at Tamandaré. So, and Beatrice's talk will be on the coral reefs of Brazil. Welcome, Beatrice.
Hello. I will start sharing my screen here now. Sure. Can you see it?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So first of all, I thank you very much for you, Dave, and also to Rui that made a very nice introduction on Brazilian coral reefs, and Milton as well. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. So I really thank the organizers for this event and opportunity. So I'm going to talk about the Brazilian coral reefs in terms of status and perspectives in community monitoring and engagement. Let me move this out of here. So in 2002, Brazil was one of the only countries in the South American NOAA that did not have a national coral reef monitoring program. So the Ministry of Environment in 2002 decided to fund a community-based pilot project. That's how we got engaged with Reef Check. That's as the perspective of Reef Check to involve the community. And then from 2004 onwards, we start regular monitoring on marine protected areas in partnerships with ICMBio, universities, community members, and other partners. Is that okay? I'm hearing someone? No. We have been participating in Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network on the status of the reefs up to 2008, and more recently on the Global Report of 2020. The protocol has been employing is a basic, it involves two sort of levels. The basic protocol that's Reef Check compatible, and also an expanded option that's equivalent to a new Caribbean Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network of level 2 and level 3. I understand this is still on construction, but this is the sort of parallel that we could establish. One of the objectives of the program is to establish MPA effectiveness is a program that's conservation-oriented and research-based. It's guided by scientists, but it's very inclusive of non-academic specialists, volunteers, dive operators, and community members in general, and incorporates traditional knowledge on sites, traditional knowledge on trends, and also on folk names for organisms. So this is some pictures of training occasions from times when you're doing training with the local community, both inside and outside of the water, and then also as well expeditions that are made with them. Also, we have stakeholder engagement. That means that dive operators help with boats and equipment and all sort of things that you need to spend hours in the water. This is the distribution. In these graphs, you can see the distribution of our monitoring sites, the sites that have been monitored. And here on our left is the percent cover of coral in pink and other indicators in other colors like macroalgae is in green. And on the right side of the screen, we have the coral species distribution. Rui was saying that we have much fewer species in Brazil, and some are endemic, but the species richness tends to increase as you move south. Coral cover that we can see on our right varies widely between the different sites that we can see on the left, and I've highlighted here marine protected areas. All these areas that you can see in orange here are marine protected areas. Some of them are long-term ecological sites now that are related to the International Long-Term Ecological Network that the Brazilian National Council supports. And here is the NCT, that's the institute that we just showed. This is the area I personally work on a long-term ecological site, and this is Abrolhos, and we partner now for sharing data and new methods and technologies as well. So we can see the variation. This is the 30% line. And an interesting thing, a pattern actually, is that we have a lower coral cover, lower hard coral cover on sites that are close to the coast, right? And this is very much linked to the history of colonization and removal of Atlantic forests. So Brazilian coral reefs are used to sedimentation, but probably they were not before, when we have pristine forests and the soil was kept in place and not eroded like in this margin. So this is probably a problem that most coastal countries face, like for sure Central America, even Australia. Like here we have sugarcane, and so it's very common that bad management of watershed leads to this type of situation. So this is a publication here. There was a special one from Global Coral Reef Monitor Network, just based on watershed management and what can be done. Coral cover trends, and this data is only up to 2018, was pretty much stable. In some areas, we saw effects of some bleaching events, like 2010, particularly in the north, but mostly was much significant variation, unless for some sites. And situations seem to fluctuate around sort of a stable site status. But then we've been having recent more bleaching events. We showed how these bleaching events have hit the coast, and this is from starting with the 1998, which was a strong one. The stronger ones are in red, and in our left we can see them moving. 2010 was strong again, and then 2016 was strong in the south, 2019 and 2020. So in these last 10 years, we've seen more bleaching than in the previous decades, and very strong bleaching as well. So these are some pictures of this bleaching effect. On the top is 2010, and down here is now 2020. And this is now. So now it's pretty cool. This is the virtual stations from NOAA for Coral Reef Watch, and temperature has gone down, but it was really hot before, and we can see the persistence of degree heating weeks for all areas monitored. was less strong in the south again, but 2019 was strong there. So some sites were hit twice by bleaching. During 2020, the coral reef monitoring was really hampered by the pandemics, because there was lots of, starting in March, there was lots of limitations on moving and going to the field. Marine parks were closed, and was limitation to going to the beaches. And that was when our engagement with local partners and local specialists was really tested. And we had very good results from this long-term partnership. For instance, this is an example in Tamandaré, where the local fishers, they've noticed bleaching. I think it's one day, maybe one day or before, one day later, I can't remember well, that we got the alert from NOAA. They said the corals are bleaching again. And since then, they've started monitoring individual colonies and reporting back, because fisheries was not, because it's so vital to the livelihoods, that was not, was stopped, although tourism was. And also in Fernando de Noronha Island, that was isolated. The local divers, the local operators did the monitoring and recorded. They used video and photo quadrants to record the local bleaching. So we also use drones. 2 minutes?
1 minute, sorry.
1 minute.
1 and a bit.
So we also use drones to monitor this time. And one interesting result that we have as well is that management has been effective. So in green, we have abundance of groupers in no-take areas. In some of them are large, but we also see the same effect in very small one. This is one is a small no-take area in the coast, and marine protected areas is also improving their health. This is good news, because coastal reefs are very important for local communities. They're important because they have the endemic species, because they have the fisheries. People really dependent on these, on tourism as well, and also on coastal protections, as we see here with the city of Recife. And Brazilian fisheries is not only important for local community, but they're also important for commerce. This is an example of fish, Brazilian reef fish being sold on the US. So the perspectives are expansion to more sites in support of local initiatives, participation of scientific network in an incorporation of new methods and technologies, and training, engagement, and awareness of local communities. So this is some of the material that was produced. And these are the links. I suppose this will be recorded. That's the area we are based at Tamandaré. And the links for material, for information. And anyway, I have a lot of people to thank, a lot of supporters all this time. And regarding the people, we could show them some of them in this video, but as we run out of time, maybe we show in the breakout session. So I thank you very much for your attention. And where do I stop sharing this screen?
Thank you very much, Beatrice.
Thank you.
That was very interesting. Lovely to see that summary of Brazilian reefs. A lot of things that connect, which perhaps we'll talk about at the end. So thank you. And now, last but not least, we'll go to Dr. Mark Eakin, who has provided some of the content that the other speakers have used that you've seen. So Mark is at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the US, and he's a coordinator of the NOAA Coral Reef Watch program, which produces those bleaching alert products. He has also served as the Chief Science Advisor for the Sundance and Emmy-winning film Chasing Coral, which I hope you've all seen, and if you haven't, please do look for it on Netflix. It's a fantastic film. Mark's talk is on climate change and coral bleaching. Are we approaching annual bleaching? And seeing Beatrice's last slides there on the increasing frequency of bleaching in Brazil, it certainly seemed like we are in some places. But over to you, Mark, and you'll have 10 minutes, and then we'll be able to get to some of the questions. So please do think of your questions and start writing them in the chat, or we can just take them live. Okay, Mark.
Great, thank you very much, David. And my thanks to all of the earlier speakers. I'll get right into things here. And we'll speak a bit about climate change and coral bleaching, what's going on around the world, and we'll come back to the Atlantic and Caribbean context of where things are at this point. You've been hearing about coral bleaching. This is imagery from American Samoa in 2014 to 2015, and this gives you an idea of what happens when corals bleach. The bleaching is recurring because of extremely high temperatures, and you're seeing on the left side the same reef, airport reef in American Samoa when it's in its healthy state, in the middle after the high temperatures have caused bleaching, and on the right after the temperatures continued and the corals died. This is the reason, the high temperature is the reason that we're running into bleaching so much, and the reason why it's increasing and becoming more of a problem is because of climate change. What you're looking at here are the graphs of global average temperatures around the world. You can see the 10 warmest years since 1880 on the diagram, and at this point 2020 is looking like it's going to come in as at least the second, maybe the first warmest year on record, certainly in the top 5, as have all of these years been in the last 20 years have been the top 10 warmest years on record. So what we do at Coral Reef Watch, and you saw some of our data expressed elsewhere, is we use satellites to look at the sea surface temperatures that cause coral bleaching around the world. Here you're looking at the 5-kilometer data that we produce on a daily basis. That's the starting point. We also look at anomalies, or how different are the temperatures right now from what they normally are. And those are valuable information for a lot of oceanographic reasons, a lot of biological reasons. But for the purposes of coral reefs, we look at something different, and we start with the hotspots. And the hotspots are actually looking at how warm the temperatures are relative to the average temperature of the warmest month of the year. Corals are adapted to the temperatures that they see year in, year out, and those warmest month of the year is at the level at which they start to become stressful. The hotspots measure a daily measure of what the temperatures are doing compared to that background climatology. We also use the degree heating week. This is a more powerful tool for predicting bleaching and looks at an accumulation of those hotspots over a 12-week period. Anytime they reach up to 4 degree weeks of stress, you have significant bleaching. At 8, you have widespread bleaching, and you start to have significant mortality. And commonly what we show are these bleaching alert area diagrams. And these show the bleaching watch, the areas where the temperatures have reached that maximum monthly mean. Bleaching warning, they've gotten to 1 degree above that, starting to accumulate the degree heating weeks. And alert levels 1 and 2 are showing the hotter conditions when the corals bleach and die. During the period from 2014 to 2017, we saw the 3rd time that we've had a global bleaching event, and this time it lasted for 3 full years. This is an accumulation of those same diagrams, the bleaching alert areas, across that 3-year period. And what you saw in 2014 to 27 was the longest global coral bleaching event ever, the most widespread and the most severe damage. And most of the areas around the world, a bit over half, were exposed twice, and many were exposed multiple years. Guam had 4 out of 5 years in a row, for example. And we'll come back and see some records from Belize in a few minutes. To give you an example of what this did on the Great Barrier Reef, in 2016, we had bleaching up here in the northern to far northern to northern central portion of the Barrier Reef. We had high bleaching in many of these areas. It was 90 to 100% bleaching, and there was 29% mortality reef-wide. So lost 29% of the corals across the entire Great Barrier Reef, focused in this northern area. In 2017, we had another bleaching event. This is the first time they've ever had back-to-back bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. And you can see here that instead of being in the far north and north, it was more in the central Great Barrier Reef. And in 2017, there was 22% mortality. The final figure of this is 2020. Just this year, we had bleaching again. So within 5 years, we've had 3 major bleaching events. The worst on record, what was the second worst on record, what may be the second worst on record in 2020. We don't have the mortality data yet, but you can see that this was an extensive event, and this was down in the south. So between the 3, most of the reefs on the Great Barrier Reef have bleached and died. So we're continuing to see these events going on. To give you an idea what's going on now in the Caribbean, getting that Atlantic perspective, we did have bleaching earlier in the year as you in in Brazil, as you heard earlier. In the Caribbean now, we've started to get alert level 2 conditions along the coasts of Central America and along the coast of South America, scattered areas of alert level 1 elsewhere in the Caribbean as well. We not only use what you were seeing a minute ago, which are satellite-based records, but we also use records that are based on climate models. And in the upper left here, what you're looking at is our climate model forecast from the run that was done this week, looking forward through the rest of this year, actually into January 2021, but that's beyond the bleaching period in the Caribbean. And what you can see is that we're expecting to reach alert level 2 conditions across all of the Caribbean. Now, to give you an example of what this looks like in one specific location, this is on the right, you're looking at a pair of diagrams for Belize, where you're looking at the first decade of our record, which starts back in 1985, and the most recent decade, so running up until 2019. We take the most recent full year, and you can see the shift in temperatures from what they were in the 1980s to what they are now. A tremendous shift, an increase of almost 1 degree Celsius in temperatures as the average temperatures on those reefs. Taking another look at that across the bottom, you're looking at that time series of temperatures from Belize, and you can see that you just start really picking up these warming events as you get in through the 90s. 1998, the big El Nino was the first global bleaching event. There you see it in Belize. You see some major events in the mid-2000s, including 2005, there was a major Caribbean bleaching event. Then we have some more bleaching in 2008, 9, 10, 11. Calms down a little, and then we have that big bleaching event I just told you about in 14, 15, 16, and into 17. And then again, another bleaching event in 2019. So what you can see is that we're increasing not only the severity of these events, but you're now reaching the point that in some locations, you're almost getting to annual bleaching. And that's something that these coral reefs just can't tolerate. It leads to a shift in the complete community dynamics of the corals. So what can be done about this when folks know that an event like this is coming? This is looking back to 2015 and the event we were predicting in Hawaii. On the left, you're looking at our outlook model. This is again the one from the climate model predicting forward from July of that year out through October. And this is at 60% and 90% probability. And the likelihood was very high that there was going to be some of the most severe bleaching that they've ever seen in Hawaii. In fact, it turned out to be pretty dead on. This is the pattern that was actually experienced when you look at the satellite data, and you can see how well that resembles what the model and forecast. Well, the folks in Hawaii started doing some work saying, you know, we're concerned if we're going to have this much bleaching. We have a number of really rare corals, endemic corals that are only found in Hawaii and are only found in a few sites. We're going to identify those. What are the ones that we want to protect the most? We're going to go out, we're going to collect them and bring them into the laboratory, into nurseries. And that's what they did. They went out, they collected these species and put them into a rare coral ark in two different nurseries, one in Oahu and one in Maui. One of the species you're looking at here is particularly important in this story, and you're looking at Porites doordeni. That species was only known from one area in the east side of Oahu and another small spot in Maui. And when the severe bleaching happened in 2015, as far as they could tell, they could not find it. It was apparently driven to complete extinction because those are the only places this species is known. Fortunately, that coral had been collected and brought into this ark for protection. And in 2019, less than 4 years after it was wiped out in the wild, that species was being rewilded and put back into the same reef in Oahu, where it was originally collected. So we're looking at a species that was driven extinct in the wild and rewilded in less than 4 years. So with things like this, we have the ability to actually protect species by knowing in advance where bleaching is likely to happen and going out and taking action. So with that, I just want to remind you of what David mentioned earlier, the film Chasing Coral. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth your time. Excellent film, multiple award winner. And if you don't have Netflix, it is on Netflix. So watch it on Netflix if you do. But if you don't, it's actually available for free on the Netflix YouTube channel. So I'll just conclude with some key messages. And in the background, you'll be seeing the animation of the 2014 to 2017 global bleaching event. And the important message here that is really going through all the reefs we've been talking about today is the rising temperatures that are causing coral bleaching, the disease, increase in disease and death of corals. 2014 to 2017 was the worst bleaching we've ever seen. And climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of coral bleaching events, in some areas nearing annual bleaching at this point. There is hope for coral reefs, but we really need to take major actions now. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Great to see that bigger picture view and how well the climate models are predicting bleaching now and actual high temperatures that we see in the water subsequently. Of course, alarming, the message, but I think it's that's one of the things that, perhaps now with the degree of awareness of climate change and biodiversity decline is when we can show how good the science is that we have, we can hopefully fast track and get through to solutions rather than trying to argue and convince people about some of these things. But now we're in the discussion session. So let me invite all the presenters to switch on their videos. And we have 15 minutes for discussion here, and then we can spill over into extra time should we need to. So I think we have the participants on the, I don't think we can get to see you, but you can write questions in the chat box. You might be able to unmute yourselves directly and have a conversation. I'll give you a chance to first. So please just welcome to any of the speakers. And if you don't have questions, I would ask any of the speakers if they wanted to add anything from their presentations to their colleagues, or didn't quite get to say anything, or want to synthesize something between the presentations. If not, of course, I do have some questions. So please.
David, I'd like to make a short comment here.
Yes, please, Milton.
Yes, I like it very much, all the presentations. Thank you very much for my colleagues. It was really interesting. And I just would like to point out about the CubeSats that Eric has shown before. And I would like to learn more about it. And I don't know if you all are aware of it, but the Air Center is proposing a kind of a constellation of small satellites or CubeSats, if you wish. And so putting all these coincidences or not together, this could be a room for making proposals focused on shallow water or coral reefs remote sensing. So just to keep that in mind, okay?
Thanks. Eric, do you want to say anything to that directly?
So I think the CubeSat and SmallSat arena is becoming quite popular. I don't know if that's the right word, but there's a lot of people putting up CubeSats for all sorts of things. And so part of my thought is, well, why not for coral reefs? Because there's one for everything else. We can do one. The technology is ready. We have capability amongst all of us to take the in-water data, to do the processing, to do it all. So I think whatever opportunities are available would be great to pursue. I'm all for it, and I'm open to whatever transpires.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Yeah, I mean that's a great one of the motivations of this of the conference and these sessions is to identify and motivate future collaboration. So there's an obvious one there. And I would also point out, so I'm on the MBON, the Marine Biodiversity Observing Network Steering Committee, that is now hosted at the Air Center. And certainly one of the objectives of the MBON, as well as the GOOSE, the Global Ocean Observing System, Biology and Ecosystems Panel, is to really foster these collaborations and get common standards going to really up our game in terms of global observing systems. And I think, when you, with your presentation, Eric, something I really noticed is that, and it's a bit of a frustration for me as biologists, we're all racing to the lowest resolution we can possibly get of 2 meters, 1 meter. But, in many parts of the world, even just having reliable, remotely sensed data at the 30 or 100 meter pixel level would be fantastic to have that, because we just don't have it. So I think that's a real, that would be a game changer.
I will say, I'm sorry to add on it, thank you, that the remote sensing doesn't replace the in-water work, the genetics and all of everything else. It doesn't replace it, but it complements it. And I think it's as you said, I think it's an important complement, because it provides the spatial perspective that you don't get scuba diving. And so I'm not advocating to replace any of the in-water work. I think that's vital, species identifications, so on and so forth. But I think that having, just as what the Coral Reef Watch has done with the bleaching alerts, has been fantastic to give people around the world these perspectives. Oh, this might be happening in a few months. I think we need that in other areas. And so I'm excited for whatever we can make happen.
Yes, thanks. Great to emphasize that. And I think you're absolutely right. Mark, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just to add on, it is amazing what they're able to do now with the small satellite constellations. And in fact, we've been doing work with the Allen Coral Atlas. This is another thing we could have discussed, is the work that's going on through Arizona State University and the Carnegie Institution, and funding from Vulcan Inc., the Paul Allen Foundation, University of Queensland. Big collaboration going on to use the small satellites in the constellations put up by Planet Laboratories. So the Planet satellites are these small satellites at meter scale resolution that are getting lots and lots of images over coral reefs. And what they've been able to do is not only use it for some of the habitat mapping, similar to the things that Eric is developing with higher spectral resolution. They're doing it with simple RGB satellites. But they're also able to pick up on coral bleaching. And during last year's bleaching in Hawaii, they were doing proof of concept and using the satellites to see where it said bleaching was occurring in Hawaii, comparing that to what our satellite data were saying where it was going to happen. And of course, there you can go out and look. And so in areas where you can go out and look, the satellites are going to be low resolution, but at least they're going to cover a large area. But the real value is those remote reefs, those places where you just can't get people out at the time that you need to get them out to. And that makes for a spectacular application of some of these small satellites. So yeah, absolutely. The CubeSats, the small satellite programs, the development of things, and some of the new work that Eric has been really working on with the high spectral resolution imagery. All of this comes together quite well.
Thanks, Mark. Does any of the other panelists want to come in on that?
Yeah, but just I would like to reinforce what the opinion of Milton and also the colleagues, that this could be a very interesting possibility if we can choose some pilot areas and do some work of this kind and testing it. And I think that this is a very good opportunity that we might have.
Yeah, thanks. So one thing I actually heard this morning on the BBC News, I was listening to it in the car, is that, of course, this is in the Great Barrier Reef now with the the bleaching events that I've seen in the last few years and the raised awareness and the commitment is that, of course, there's much better remote sensing tools coming up, but they're also managing to motivate a much larger number of observers. So the tourist operators and fishermen and others that go out on the reef, and they're just announcing today, I think was the first day of mobilizing people, you know, across the 3,000 kilometers of the reef to go out and collect in-water observations to help ground truthing the satellite images and remote sensing and all of the other data that we can get. So that's a fantastic example of using all the technologies together. Okay, let's have other questions or comments from the panel or from the attendees that we have. Please do just speak up, Beatrice.
I have a question and a comment to my satellite colleagues. We have done some work here in the region with using worldview and Landsat for prediction of areas where they were more using like benthic terrain models and this machine learning tools to predict areas that were more appropriated for coral growth. And sometimes these areas are suitable, but the corals are gone. So what you guys think of this use also to pick up protected areas when you want to choose the best areas to protect, when you cannot, you know, set up everything aside, but you can get better information for this. So it's going beyond the observation and trying to model the local conditions, the terrain as for its suitability.
I think that's a perfect example of the situation where you need all of the data. If remote sensing data helps, modeling data helps, in-water data, everything you can bring to bear. Why does this region not have any coral? It is a really big question. And so whatever tools you have, that's the sort of thing you use them as best you can. It's not. I don't think any one tool will give you the answers you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now in the time of restoration as well. So sometimes restoration doesn't need much intervention apart from leaving the reef, reducing the impacts on the reef. So this is usually a hard decision. So this maybe those tools could help to inform and make it more prone to success.
The other is, you know, as you're saying that, you know, we have to pick a lot of tools and use a lot of tools to apply to this. Brazil is a classic example. A lot of the reefs in Brazil are relatively high sediment environments. And so when you're using a satellite and trying to look at reefs in high sediment environments, it just doesn't work very well. You know, some places it'll work, sometimes it'll work, but the more sediment there is, the shallower the depth you're going to be able to penetrate. And so, yeah, that shows one of those cases where we have two things. One is the need to go out into the water with divers and use other techniques. And the other is the advantage of using these satellites that are up there all the time. Because in Brazil, there have been a number of events where under calm wind conditions, you have a lot of the sediment starts to settle out, the CDOM bleaches, and you get really clear water. And during those moments, you might be able to spot some reefs that you didn't know that were there just because the satellites are always going over. So we're going to have to be opportunistic and we're going to have to be creative.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on this, Mark, because not every Brazilian reef is really murky.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, I was going to include this in the presentation, then I thought it's too much for 10 minutes, but we also done some work. It was the work of a PhD student in our postdoc that's called Pushing Satellite Imagery to New Depths, because we were able to see paleochannels across shelf up to 70 meters depth with Landsat. So it's under special conditions as the satellite imagery is getting so much better, isn't it? Like Landsat has now the ocean blue a possibility. So it's I think we might find good conditions in Brazil as well, not everywhere. The other thing is that the reefs are not flat. Brazilian reefs are typically, like big mushrooms. So really, you can only see the top from above. What you can see perhaps is this complexity that may be the proxy for other type of system, but there is also, this would be a limitation as well, the amount of things that you cannot see from the top, they're hidden.
I think that's a good point. Again, it's the tool you have, and it would also be sort of neat, and not just neat, but useful and ultimately important to provide important data, to put fleets of AUVs that can go back and forth underneath the mouth of the Amazon, and with whether they have sonar or other observing things that could be measuring water chemistry and currents, and to understand, to see the reefs you can't see from scuba diving or from space, and having those tools, I think is almost equally as important, especially when you think of things about the mesophotic reefs that may be what do you call not reservoirs, there's a word, but refugia, that's the word. So the mesophotic reefs, which you can't see with satellites, and which the sea surface temperature doesn't necessarily match up with. So you being able to routinely observe those, and they're very extensive. So I think that technology can help us here as well. It's a different technology.
Okay, if I can just interject now, because we're just about the time where we're going to switch modes. So for those of you who are on the live viewing online, in the chat box, there's the link to the Zoom room. If you'll please join us here, because I think the live streaming will go to another session. And we do have a question from one of the attendees on the live stream. And that is, so I think perhaps this would be for Rui. How will you view the impact of oil spills on coral reefs? Can this be comparable with temperature changes? I suppose that's also a question for remote sensing. Can we see the impact of oil spills from remotely sensed data?
Well, still don't know. We have to see. Well, in fact, we had in many reefs, despite it, the reefs were fully covered with oil. The next tide itself could clean part of it. So part of the oil were collected by people, and part was naturally cleansed. So we still have to go there. This, as Beatrice said, this COVID-19 was a problem for us, because we are not going, still not going to the reefs. That's why, as Beatrice said as well, the engagement of people that can go, the communities that lives in these places and can go to the water is very important and very welcome. That's why we are trying to connect to them and see if we can accelerate or gather the data more quickly. I think that I feel that the bleaching would be more harmful for corals than the oil itself, but I cannot say.
Thank you. And if I understood right from your figure, this was a single oil spill that spread across the whole coastline. Is that right? It was that large?
Yes, we had most of the coastline tinted with oil, not the whole, but very great stretches of beaches and coral reefs that was oiled. Okay. So it was tons of oil,
Okay.
really.
Wow. Wow. And a question for any of the remote sensors. Sorry, Beatrice, go ahead.
I just want to compliment what Rui was saying. I live nearby an area that was hit, and the oil came from probably a ship that spilled oil. And when the oil arrived, because we have mesotides here, that's how we say mesotide. The tides are sort of 2.5 meters and 3. The oil came and entered the passes between reefs and went straight in the estuaries. So the estuaries and the mangroves were the most hardly hit. And then people went to the beach as well, and people did a huge cleaning because tourism is so important. Everyone was there risking themselves and cleaning everything, and some of the oil sunk. So probably the harm that's doing now, it's apart from the reefs that were really touched by the oil, is because the oil sort of comes up again. It sunk to the sand, but it comes up again from time to time. So Rui showed a photo of a plankton with oil in its mouth. So we did some plankton tours, and all the plankton they were munching on oil. So maybe we will see some effect on populations in the years to come, because it was spawning time for many organisms, and maybe this is going to be the main impact. But for sure, I do agree with Rui that for corals, the bleaching that came afterwards, it was so much worse.